The sound of shattering glass echoed through the dusty Rose Saloon, and Zane Nolan didn't flinch as he watched the drunken miner crash through the window onto the muddy street of Portland, Oregon, his knuckles still bleeding from the impact. It was 1878, and violence was as common as rain in this timber town built along the Willamette River, where fortunes were made in logging camps and lost at card tables. Zane wiped his hands on his leather vest and turned back to his whiskey, his face as impassive as the granite mountains that loomed in the distance. The other patrons quickly returned to their drinks and conversations, knowing better than to comment on anything the harsh cowboy did. He had arrived in Portland 6 months ago from the cattle ranges of eastern Oregon, hired by the logging company to protect their payroll shipments and keep order among the rowdy workers who flooded into town every Saturday night with pockets full of wages and heads full of liquor. Nobody in Portland had ever seen Zane Nolan smile. Nobody had heard him raise his voice in anger or soften it in kindness. He did his job with mechanical efficiency, breaking up fights with brutal swiftness, escorting drunks to the jail with iron grips on their collars, and riding shotgun on the timber company wagons with his rifle across his lap and his eyes scanning the tree line for trouble. The logging bosses loved him because he was reliable and ruthless. The workers feared him because his face never betrayed mercy or hesitation. The saloon girls stopped trying to flirt with him after the first week when he paid them no more attention than he would a hitching post. He was 26 years old, built like he had been carved from the same Douglas firs that the loggers felled every day, with dark hair that fell past his collar and gray eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. The winter rain had started early that November, turning Portland streets into rivers of mud that sucked at wagon wheels and boot heels. Zane stood under the awning of the general store, watching the downpour and waiting for the timber company manager to finish his business inside. A stagecoach rolled into town, its wheels throwing up brown spray, and lurched to a stop outside the hotel across the street. The driver climbed down and opened the door, extending his hand to help a passenger descend. A woman emerged, her green traveling dress already spattered with mud, her auburn hair escaping from beneath a practical bonnet. She clutched a carpet bag in one hand and a leather satchel in the other, looking around at the rough timber town with an expression that mixed determination with barely concealed dismay. Zane watched without particular interest as she paid the driver and hurried through the rain toward the hotel entrance. She slipped on the muddy boardwalk and dropped her carpet bag, which tumbled into a puddle. Before she could retrieve it, a logger lurching out of the saloon next door stumbled into her, sending her sprawling backward. Zane moved then, crossing the street in long strides, reaching her before she hit the ground. His arm caught her around the waist, steadying her with the same impersonal efficiency he brought to everything. She looked up at him, raindrops clinging to her eyelashes, her eyes a startling shade of amber. "Thank you," she gasped, regaining her footing. He released her immediately, retrieved her carpet bag from the puddle, and handed it to her without a word. Then he turned and walked back to his post under the awning, leaving her staring after him with a confused expression on her face. That evening, Zane learned that the woman was Thea Mitchell, the new schoolteacher Portland had been expecting for 2 months. The previous teacher had fled back to San Francisco after a winter of isolation and rough conditions, leaving the town's children running wild. Thea had come from Sacramento, where she had taught at a private girls' academy before her father's gambling debts had destroyed the family's reputation and forced her to seek employment in less particular places. She was 23 years old, educated, and entirely unprepared for the reality of a frontier logging town, where most men could barely write their names, and saw no reason their children should do better. The schoolhouse was a single room built from rough-hewn planks, with gaps that let in the rain, and a stove that smoked more than it heated. Thea arrived at dawn on Monday morning to find it filled with 23 children ranging from 6 to 14, most of them dirty, all of them skeptical, and several of them openly hostile to the idea of sitting still and learning to read. By noon, she had broken up 3 fights, confiscated 2 knives, and discovered that half her students had never seen the inside of a schoolroom before. By the end of the week, she was exhausted, frustrated, and seriously reconsidering her decision to come to Portland. She saw the harsh cowboy around town occasionally. He nodded to her once when she passed him on the boardwalk, a slight inclination of his head that might have been acknowledgement or might have been an accident. She noticed that everyone gave him a wide berth, that conversation stopped when he entered the general store, that even the roughest loggers seemed to think twice before causing trouble when he was nearby. She wondered what had happened to make a man so thoroughly closed off from the world, but she was too busy trying to survive her own challenges to spend much time thinking about the mysterious Zane Nolan. December brought snow to the higher elevations and more rain to Portland itself, turning the town into a miserable landscape of gray skies and brown mud. Thea struggled to keep the schoolhouse warm enough for learning, arriving an hour early each morning to coax the stubborn stove into producing heat. Her students slowly began to accept her presence, though progress was agonizingly slow. The older boys particularly resented being forced to attend school when they could be earning wages in the logging camps, and one of them, a 15-year-old named Jake Carson, who was bigger than most grown men, had made it clear he considered the entire enterprise a waste of his time. On a Thursday afternoon in mid-December, Jake decided he had had enough. When Thea corrected his spelling for the 3rd time, he stood up, knocking his desk over with a crash that made the younger children jump. "I don't need some fancy lady from California telling me how to write," he snarled. "I'm done with this." Thea stood her ground, though her heart was hammering. "Sit down, Jake. We're not finished for the day. I said I'm done." He moved toward the door, and when Thea stepped into his path, he shoved her aside with enough force to send her stumbling against the wall. The other students gasped. Jake was already out the door when Thea regained her balance, her shoulder throbbing where it had hit the rough wood. That evening, she reported the incident to the town council, such as it was. The 3 men who served as Portland's unofficial government listened to her with expressions that ranged from bored to sympathetic. "Jake's almost 16, one of them said finally. "That's old enough to quit school if he wants. His pa needs him in the camps anyway." "He assaulted me," Thea protested. "You cannot allow that kind of behavior." "Now, Miss Mitchell, assaulted is a strong word. Boys get rowdy sometimes. It's just their nature." Thea left the meeting seething with frustration and anger. She walked through the cold evening toward the boarding house, where she rented a room, her breath forming white clouds in the air. She had given up a safer, easier life to come here, had believed she could make a difference, and the town's leaders wouldn't even support her when a student became violent. Tears of frustration blurred her vision as she climbed the steps to her room. The next day, Jake showed up at school with 2 of his friends, all of them clearly drunk despite the early hour. They disrupted every lesson, laughed at Thea's attempts to restore order, and finally began throwing books at the younger children, sending several of them fleeing in tears. Thea tried to physically remove Jake from the schoolhouse, but he was twice her size and simply laughed at her efforts. "Go back to California, teacher lady," he taunted. Nobody wants you here." She finally managed to get them out by threatening to fetch the sheriff, though she knew the sheriff rarely intervened in what he considered minor disputes. When the door finally closed behind the troublemakers, she sank into her chair, looking at the chaos they had left behind. Books were scattered across the floor, desks were overturned, and the younger children who remained looked at her with expressions that mixed sympathy with doubt about her ability to protect them. That afternoon, as she was trying to clean up the mess, the door opened. Thea looked up, half expecting Jake to have returned, but it was Zane Nolan who filled the doorway. He surveyed the disordered room with those expressionless gray eyes, then looked at her. "Heard you had trouble," he said. His voice was deep and rough, as if he didn't use it often. "Nothing I cannot handle," Thea said stiffly, though the evidence around her suggested otherwise. Zane didn't argue. He simply stood there for a moment longer, then nodded and left. Thea felt a flash of irritation. If he wasn't going to help, why bother coming at all? The next morning, Jake and his friends were waiting outside the schoolhouse when Thea arrived. They had clearly been drinking all night, and their intentions were written plainly on their faces. "School's closed today, teacher," Jake announced. "In fact, maybe it should stay closed. This town doesn't need someone like you telling us what to do." Thea's hands trembled as she clutched her books, but she kept her voice steady. "Get out of my way, Jake. I have students coming. Then they can go home." He took a step toward her, and his friends spread out to block any escape route. Thea's heart raced as she realized how isolated the schoolhouse was, how early the hour, how unlikely that anyone would intervene even if they heard her scream. The sound of boots on the boardwalk made Jake turn. Zane Nolan was walking toward them, his hand resting casually on the gun at his hip. He didn't hurry, didn't call out, just approached with that same unhurried, inevitable quality that characterized everything he did. Jake straightened, trying to look confident. "This isn't your business, Nolan." Zane stopped about 10 feet away. "It is now. Leave. She's just a teacher. Nobody's going to care if we scare her off like the last one. I will care." Zane's voice hadn't changed, still flat and emotionless, but something in his posture made Jake take a step backward. "You can walk away, or I can make you crawl away. Choose." Jake's friends were already moving, backing down the street with their hands raised. Jake held out for another moment, trying to salvage his pride, but when Zane's hand moved fractionally closer to his gun, the boy broke and ran. Zane watched until they disappeared around a corner, then turned to Thea. "They won't bother you again." "Why?" The question burst out of her before she could stop it. "Why do you care what happens to me?" For just a second, something flickered in those gray eyes, something that might have been surprise or confusion. Then it was gone, and his face was stone again. "This town needs a school," he said. "Can't have one without a teacher." He tipped his hat to her and walked away, leaving Thea standing alone with her books clutched to her chest, and her heart beating in an entirely different rhythm than it had been a few minutes before. After that morning, Jake Carson and his friends disappeared from Portland entirely, finding work in a logging camp up the Columbia River. Thea never asked what Zane had said or done to accomplish that, but she was grateful for the reprieve. Her classroom settled into something resembling routine, and she began to see actual progress in her students. They learned their letters, practiced their numbers, and slowly started to believe that education might offer them something better than the dangerous, backbreaking work of the timber industry. She saw Zane around town, always at a distance, always alone. He never approached her, never spoke beyond a nod of acknowledgement, but she found herself noticing him more and more. The way he carried himself with that quiet, contained strength. The way his presence seemed to create a bubble of calm in the chaos of the frontier town. The way he looked at the world with those guarded eyes that seemed to expect nothing good from it. Christmas came and went. Thea spent it alone in her boarding house room, eating a simple dinner and thinking about her family in Sacramento, wondering if her father had recovered from his disgrace, if her mother still mourned the life they had lost. She had written to them when she first arrived in Portland, but no letters had come in return. She told herself she didn't care, that she was building a new life here, but the loneliness sat heavy in her chest as she listened to the sounds of celebration from the saloon down the street. January 1879 brought heavy snow to Portland, rare enough to be exciting for the children and troublesome for everyone else. The schoolhouse became even harder to heat, and Thea found herself burning through firewood at an alarming rate. She mentioned it to the town council, who promised to send more but never seemed to get around to it. She started arriving earlier and earlier each morning, trying to get the room warm before her students arrived. But it was a losing battle against the drafts that whistled through every crack in the walls. One morning she arrived to find a cord of neatly split firewood stacked beside the schoolhouse door, enough to last the rest of the winter. Nobody would tell her who had delivered it, though she had her suspicions. That same week, someone repaired the worst of the gaps in the walls, stuffing them with oakum and tar that cut down on the drafts considerably. When she asked around, people just shrugged and changed the subject. In late January, a fire broke out in one of the timber warehouses near the river, spreading quickly through the dry wood and threatening to engulf half the town. Everyone who could carry a bucket formed a chain from the river to the flames, including Thea's students and herself. They worked for hours in the freezing cold, passing buckets until her arms ached and her dress was soaked through with icy water. Zane was there too, appearing and disappearing in the smoke, organizing the efforts with quiet efficiency, pulling men out of danger when the walls began to collapse. When the fire was finally contained, long after midnight, Thea stood shivering by the river, too exhausted to walk back to her room. She felt a coat settle over her shoulders, heavy and warm and smelling of leather and smoke. She turned to find Zane standing beside her, his shirt soaked with water and ash, his face streaked with soot. "You should get inside," he said. "It's cold." "You should too," she managed through chattering teeth. "Thank you for the coat." He looked at her for a long moment, and she thought she saw something in his eyes, some shadow of feeling quickly suppressed. Then he nodded and walked away into the darkness, leaving her wrapped in his coat and wondering about the man beneath that impenetrable exterior. She returned the coat to him the next day, cleaned and folded. He took it without comment, but something had shifted between them. He started appearing at odd moments, always at a distance, but always watching. When she walked home in the evenings, she would catch glimpses of him on the street behind her, close enough to help if needed, but far enough to maintain that careful distance. She should have found it unsettling, but instead she felt safer knowing he was there. February brought a thaw, and with it came trouble from the logging camps upriver. A dispute over wages had turned ugly, and a group of angry workers were marching on Portland, intent on confronting the timber company owners who lived in the town's nicest houses. The sheriff deputized every man who could hold a gun, including Zane, and prepared for violence. Thea closed school early and barricaded herself in her boarding house room, listening to the shouting in the streets below. The confrontation lasted 2 days, tense standoffs punctuated by brief outbursts of fighting. Zane was in the thick of it, she heard later, standing between the angry loggers and the company men, somehow managing to convince both sides to step back from full-scale war. When it was finally over, a compromise had been reached, modest wage increases in exchange for the workers returning to their camps. Several men on both sides were injured, but nobody had been killed, which most people considered a miracle. Thea saw Zane 3 days later crossing the street to the general store. His left arm was in a sling, and he moved with the careful stiffness of someone hiding pain. Without thinking about it, she followed him into the store. He was trying to pick up supplies with one hand, clearly struggling. She walked up beside him. "Let me help." He looked at her with surprise, the most emotion she had ever seen on his face. "I can manage. I know you can. Let me help anyway." She picked up the items he had been reaching for, adding them to the basket he carried. They worked in silence, gathering what he needed, and then she carried the basket to the counter while he paid. Outside, she helped him pack the supplies into his saddlebags. "How bad is it?" she asked, nodding at his arm. "Knife wound. It will heal. You should see a doctor. Already did." He looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time she saw uncertainty in those gray eyes. "Why are you doing this?" "Because you helped me when I needed it. Because you have helped me more than you probably think I know about. Because maybe beneath that hard exterior, you are just someone who needs a friend." The words came out before she could stop them, more honest than she had intended. Something happened to his face then, a subtle shifting that wasn't quite a smile but was at least a softening. "I am not good at being a friend. Maybe you just never had practice." She finished with the saddlebags and stepped back. "Thank you, Zane, for everything you have done, whether you wanted credit for it or not." She walked away before he could respond, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration at her own boldness. Behind her, Zane stood motionless beside his horse, watching her go with an expression that would have surprised anyone who knew him. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was the closest he had come to one in years. After that day, things changed in small, almost imperceptible ways. When Thea left school in the evenings, Zane was often nearby, and instead of keeping his distance, he would fall into step beside her, walking her back to her boarding house. They didn't talk much at first. She would comment on her students' progress or mention something interesting she had read, and he would listen with that same focused attention he brought to everything. Sometimes he would respond with a sentence or two, his voice still gruff, but no longer quite so distant. March brought spring rains and the first hints of renewal. The trees began to bud, and Thea's students became restless with the promise of warmer weather. She organized a field trip down to the river to study the salmon beginning their spawning runs, and to her surprise, Zane volunteered to come along to help supervise. The children were fascinated by the fish fighting their way upstream, and even more fascinated by the normally stoic Cowboy, answering their endless questions about wildlife and tracking with unexpected patience. Thea watched him crouching beside a group of younger children, pointing out the different species of salmon, his voice low and steady as he explained their life cycles. She saw glimpses of the man he might have been before whatever had happened to build those walls around his heart. When one of the girls asked him why he always looked so serious, he paused for a long moment. "Sometimes life is serious," he said finally, "but that doesn't mean there isn't beauty in it too." Walking back to town, Thea found herself beside him at the back of the group of chattering children. "You were good with them today," she said. "They ask a lot of questions. That's what children do, it's how they learn." She smiled at him. "You could smile sometimes, you know, it wouldn't kill you." He looked at her, something almost like amusement flickering across his features. "How do you know?" It was such an unexpected response that she laughed, a genuine sound of delight that made several of the children turn to look. Zane watched her laugh with an expression she couldn't quite read, but when they reached town and parted ways, she thought she saw the corners of his mouth turn up, just slightly. April arrived with warmer weather and longer days. Thea had been in Portland for 6 months, and while it still wasn't the life she had imagined for herself, she had come to love her students and feel a genuine investment in their futures. The town itself remained rough and often frustrating, but it was becoming home in ways she hadn't expected. She had also, though she tried not to think about it too much, become deeply aware of Zane Nolan. Their evening walks had become routine, something she looked forward to all day. He talked more now, sharing carefully chosen details about his past. He had grown up on a cattle ranch in the high desert of eastern Oregon, the oldest of 4 children. His father had been a hard man who believed emotions were weakness, and had taught his sons to suppress any sign of feeling. When Zane was 18, his mother and 2 younger sisters had died in a diphtheria outbreak, and his father had forbidden the surviving sons to grieve, insisting they continue working as if nothing had happened. Zane had left 2 years later, unable to endure his father's cold tyranny any longer. He had drifted across Oregon and Northern California, taking work as a ranch hand, a guard, and occasionally a bounty hunter. He had learned to make himself useful through violence and intimidation, and he had learned to never let anyone see what he was feeling because feelings had always been punished in his world. "I don't even know if I can feel things the way other people do," he told her one evening as they stood watching the sunset paint the sky over the river. "It has been so long since I tried." Thea looked at him, at the rigid set of his shoulders and the careful blankness of his expression. "I think you feel things very deeply," she said quietly. "I think you just learned to hide it so well that you forgot how to let yourself feel them at all." He didn't respond to that, but she saw his jaw tighten, saw the way his hands clenched and then deliberately relaxed. They walked the rest of the way to her boarding house in silence, but when they reached her door, he looked at her with eyes that held a confusion of emotions he couldn't quite name. "Why do you spend time with me?" he asked. "You could choose anyone in this town." "But I choose you," she said simply. "Good night, Zane." She went inside before she could see his reaction, before she could examine too closely why her heart was racing, and why the thought of not seeing him the next day left her feeling hollow. May brought the revelation that she was in love with him. Thea had been fighting the realization for weeks, telling herself it was just gratitude or loneliness or the simple human need for connection. But one afternoon, watching him repair a broken step on the schoolhouse with methodical care, she finally admitted the truth to herself. She loved this harsh, guarded man who had been damaged by life but who still tried in his quiet way to protect and help others. She loved his strength and his surprising gentleness with her students. She loved the way he listened when she talked, giving her his complete attention as if her words were the most important thing in his world. She loved him, and she had no idea if he could ever love her back. That evening, as they walked by the river, she tried to find the courage to say something. But the words stuck in her throat, held back by fear of his rejection, fear of seeing that blank mask slam down over his face if she revealed feelings he couldn't reciprocate. So she said nothing, and they walked in companionable silence while her heart ached with unspoken words. June brought the end of the school year, and a celebration in town. The children performed recitations and demonstrated their progress to proud parents who marveled at their newfound ability to read and write. Thea felt genuine pride in what she had accomplished, though she knew the battle for education in Portland was far from won. After the ceremony, there was a dance at the community hall, and Thea found herself surrounded by men asking for dances. Rough loggers and workers who cleaned up surprisingly well and wanted a chance to hold a respectable woman in their arms. She danced with several of them, making polite conversation and counting the minutes until she could leave. Then she saw Zane standing by the wall, watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. She excused herself from her current partner and walked over to him. "Would you like to dance?" she asked. He looked startled, almost alarmed. "I don't dance." "Neither did I before tonight, but I'm learning." She held out her hand. "Please." For a moment she thought he would refuse. Then he took her hand, his calloused fingers closing around hers with surprising gentleness, and led her onto the floor. He danced stiffly, mechanically, clearly uncomfortable with the proximity and the attention, but he didn't let go of her hand. Thea looked up at him, seeing the tension in his jaw, the rigid control he was exerting over himself. "You can relax," she said softly. "It's just me." "That's the problem," he muttered so quietly she almost didn't hear it. "What do you mean?" But he didn't answer, just guided her through the rest of the dance in silence. When the music ended, he released her immediately, nodded stiffly, and left the hall. Thea watched him go with a sinking feeling in her chest, wondering what she had done wrong. He didn't come to walk her home that evening, and when she looked for him the next day, he was nowhere to be found. The day after that, she learned he had taken a job escorting a valuable shipment to Salem and would be gone for at least a week. She felt his absence like a physical ache, and she realized how much her life had come to revolve around those evening conversations, those small moments of connection. When he returned 10 days later, she was walking back from the general store with her arms full of supplies for her boarding house room. She saw him riding down the main street, and her heart leaped with joy and relief. But when he saw her, he just nodded, the same impersonal acknowledgement he might give to any acquaintance, and rode past without stopping. Thea stood frozen in the middle of the street, feeling something crack inside her chest. He was pushing her away. Whatever had been growing between them, he was deliberately destroying it, rebuilding those walls she had thought were slowly coming down. She made it back to her room before the tears came, hot and angry and heartbroken all at once. For the next 3 weeks, Zane avoided her. He took jobs that kept him out of town, and when he was in Portland, he kept to the opposite side of the street. Thea told herself she didn't care, that she had been foolish to imagine he could ever return her feelings, that she should focus on preparing for the new school year and forget about the harsh cowboy who couldn't or wouldn't let himself feel. But her heart didn't listen to logic, and every glimpse of him from a distance made the ache worse. July brought oppressive heat and forest fires in the mountains, filling the air with smoke and turning the sun blood red. The town was on edge, worried that the fires would spread to the logging operations, or, worse, to Portland itself. Thea struggled through days that felt airless and nights that brought no relief, and she told herself the heaviness in her chest was just the smoke, not the weight of unspoken feelings and lost connection. Then came the day that changed everything. Thea had stayed late at the schoolhouse, working on lesson plans for the upcoming year. The sun was setting when she finally left, painting the smoke-filled sky in shades of orange and red. She was halfway back to her boarding house when she heard shouting from one of the alleys between buildings. She knew she should keep walking, knew that getting involved in trouble in a place like Portland was dangerous, but something about the voice made her stop and turn in the alley. 3 men had cornered a young woman, probably one of the saloon girls based on her gaudy dress and painted face. They were drunk and aggressive, and their intentions were clearly terrible. Thea didn't think, just acted, running into the alley and shouting, "Leave her alone." The men turned, surprised by the interruption. One of them laughed. "Well, look at this. The school teacher wants to play hero." He moved toward Thea with a leer that made her skin crawl. "Maybe you want to join the fun." Thea backed up, her heart pounding, realizing she had made a terrible mistake. She opened her mouth to scream, and one of the men lunged forward and grabbed her arm, yanking her deeper into the alley. The other girl took the opportunity to run, her footsteps echoing on the boardwalk as she fled. Thea struggled, but she was hopelessly overpowered. Rough hands grabbed at her dress, and she heard fabric tear. Pure terror flooded through her as she realized what was about to happen. Then one of the men was flying backward, crashing into the wall with a sickening thud. Zane was there, appearing like an avenging angel in the smoke-dimmed light. His face was a mask of cold fury as he threw another man aside with brutal efficiency. The third man pulled a knife and Thea screamed a warning, but Zane had already seen it. He moved with deadly precision, disarming the man and breaking his wrist in one smooth motion. The fight was over in seconds. The three men fled, one of them cradling his arm and moaning in pain. Zane stood breathing hard, his fist still clenched, and then he turned to Thea. For just a moment she saw raw, undisguised fear in his eyes, fear for her, and then his face went blank again. "Are you hurt?" His voice was rough, barely controlled. "No, She looked down at her torn dress, at the bruises already forming on her arms, and something broke inside her. The terror of what had almost happened, the emotional pain of the last 3 weeks, the exhaustion of trying to be strong in a place that constantly challenged her. All of it came crashing down at once. She started to cry, great gasping sobs that shook her whole body. Zane stood frozen, clearly at a loss. "You're safe now," he said awkwardly. "They won't come back." But she couldn't stop crying, couldn't contain the flood of emotion that had finally found release. She sank down, sitting on the dirty ground of the alley, her face in her hands, and wept. That was when Zane Nolan felt his heart break for the first time in his life. He had spent 26 years building walls, suppressing feelings, turning himself into something hard and unfeeling, because that was what the world had demanded of him. He had watched his mother and sisters die without shedding a tear, had left his childhood home without looking back, had lived a life of violence and loneliness without allowing himself to acknowledge the cost. But seeing Thea broken and crying, knowing he had contributed to her pain by pushing her away, something inside him cracked wide open. He felt it physically, a sharp pain in his chest that made him gasp. He felt the walls he had built so carefully crumbling, felt emotions he had suppressed for years flooding through him all at once. Fear for her safety, guilt for his cowardice, and underneath it all, love so powerful it terrified him. He loved her. He loved her gentleness and her strength, her determination and her kindness, the way she saw good in him that he had never seen in himself. He loved her, and he had nearly lost her because he had been too damaged and afraid to admit it. He dropped to his knees beside her in the dirt, not caring about his dignity or his reputation or anything except making her stop crying. "Thea." His voice cracked on her name. "Please, please don't cry." She looked up at him, tears streaming down her face, and saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. The mask was gone. For the first time since she had met him, Zane's face showed everything he was feeling, naked and vulnerable and completely unguarded. "Why?" she asked brokenly. "Why did you push me away? I thought we were friends. I thought there might be something more, and then you just disappeared." "Because I was afraid." The words came out hoarse, painful. "Because I have never felt what I feel for you, and I didn't know how to handle it. Because I thought if I stayed away, I could go back to being what I was before, but I can't. I can't stop thinking about you. I can't stop wanting to be near you. I can't stop." He stopped, breathing hard, looking at her with eyes that held years of suppressed emotion finally finding release. "Can't stop what?" she whispered. "Loving you." The confession seemed to cost him everything, his voice breaking on the words. I love you, Thea. I didn't know I still could. I didn't know my heart still worked that way. But it does, and it's breaking right now watching you cry, and I don't know how to make it stop. Thea stared at him, tears still falling but her sobs quieting. She saw the truth written plainly on his face, saw the pain and wonder and terror of someone experiencing real emotion for the first time in years. She reached up with trembling hands and touched his face, feeling the roughness of his unshaven jaw, the warmth of his skin, the slight tremor that ran through him at her touch. "You don't make it stop," she said softly. "You learn to live with it. You let it change you. You let it make you vulnerable and real and human again." She smiled through her tears. "I love you too, Zane. I have for months. I was just too afraid to say it." He closed his eyes, and she saw moisture on his lashes, tears he had probably not shed since he was a child. When he opened them again, they were bright with feeling. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "I don't know how to be what you deserve. Then we'll learn together." She leaned forward and kissed him, gentle and careful, a promise rather than a demand. For a moment he didn't move, shock holding him frozen. Then he kissed her back with a desperation that spoke of years of loneliness and longing, his arms coming around her and pulling her close. They knelt together in that dirty alley as the sun set, and the smoke-filled sky darkened above them, holding each other like drowning people who had finally found something solid to cling to. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Zane rested his forehead against hers. "I am not going to be good at this," he warned. "I am going to make mistakes. I am going to forget to say things I should say and do things wrong. Then you will be like every other man who ever tried to love someone," Thea said with a watery laugh. "I am not asking for perfection, Zane. I am just asking for you. The real you, not the walls you hide behind." He pulled back to look at her, really look at her, and she saw a smile start to form on his face. It was tentative and unpracticed, but it was genuine, transforming his harsh features into something almost beautiful. "You are the bravest person I have ever met," he said. "Running into that alley was stupid and terrifying and incredibly brave," says the man who followed me in to fight 3 armed men. She touched his face again, marveling at the freedom to do so. "Take me home, Zane." He stood and pulled her to her feet, keeping his arm around her waist as they left the alley. He walked her back to her boarding house through the smoke-hazed evening, and at her door, he kissed her again, slower this time, learning the shape of her lips and the taste of her tears. "I will see you tomorrow," he promised, "and every day after if you will have me." "Always," she whispered. The next weeks were a revelation for both of them. Zane courted Thea with an intensity that surprised everyone in Portland who had thought him incapable of softness. He brought her flowers he picked himself from the meadows outside town. He spent his evenings with her, talking and laughing and slowly learning to share the parts of himself he had kept locked away for so long. He smiled more, and though it still came slowly, each one felt like a gift to Thea. For her part, Thea discovered depths to Zane she had only glimpsed before. He was wickedly intelligent, reading through the books she lent him with surprising speed and engaging her in discussions about philosophy and science. He was protective but not controlling, always aware of her safety but trusting her judgment. And he was gradually learning to show affection. Small gestures at first, a hand on her back, fingers intertwined with hers, and then larger ones, pulling her into his arms when they were alone, kissing her with a passion that left them both breathless. August brought cooler weather and the return of rain, extinguishing the forest fires and washing the smoke from the air. Thea prepared for the new school year with Zane's help, and when classes started again, he was often there in the evenings helping with repairs or supervising the older students who needed extra work. The children quickly accepted his presence, and Thea watched with joy as he became more comfortable with them, even occasionally joking with the older boys who had once intimidated him with their casual affection. In September, on a cool evening under the stars by the river, Zane asked Thea to marry him. He did it awkwardly, stumbling over words and forgetting half of what he had planned to say, but the sincerity was unmistakable. "I know I am not what anyone would choose," he said, holding her hands in his. "I know I come with damage and scars and habits that will be hard to live with, but I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone, and I want to spend the rest of my life learning to be better for you." Thea was crying again, but these were tears of joy. "Yes," she said. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." They married in October 1879, in a simple ceremony at the Portland church with half the town in attendance. Thea wore a dress of cream-colored silk that she had ordered from San Francisco, and Zane wore his best suit and a tie that kept trying to strangle him. When the minister asked if he would take Thea to be his wife, Zane's "I will" came out fierce and certain, and when he kissed his bride, there were tears on his face that he made no attempt to hide. They moved into a small house on the edge of town, and Zane took a less dangerous job as a foreman for one of the logging companies, overseeing operations rather than riding shotgun on dangerous deliveries. Thea continued teaching, finding renewed purpose in her work now that her personal life was so full. They built a life together slowly, learning each other's rhythms and habits, arguing occasionally but always making up before sleep, growing together in ways that felt miraculous to Zane, who had never imagined he could have something like this. In the spring of 1880, Thea discovered she was pregnant. Zane's reaction was complex, joy mixed with terror at the thought of being responsible for a child. "What if I am like my father?" he asked her one night, his voice raw with fear. "What if I cannot love our child the way they deserve?" Thea took his face in her hands and made him look at her. "You are nothing like your father," she said firmly. "You have learned to feel again. You have learned to love. You will be a wonderful father because you know what it is like to grow up without emotional warmth, and you will never let our children experience that." Their son was born in December, squalling and red-faced and perfect. They named him Jacob, and when Zane held him for the first time, Thea saw tears streaming down his face, tears of overwhelming love and joy and wonder. "He is so small," Zane whispered, cradling the baby with infinite care. "How can something so small hold so much?" "That's what love does," Thea said, exhausted but radiant. "It makes impossible things possible." Zane was a devoted father, surprising himself with his capacity for tenderness. He sang to Jacob at night in a voice rough from disuse, ancient ballads his mother had taught him before she died. He walked the floor with his son when the baby was fussy, soothing him with patience Thea marveled at. He was fiercely protective but also gentle, understanding instinctively that strength was not the opposite of softness. The years that followed were full and rich. In 1882, they had a daughter they named Rose, and in 1884, another son they named Thomas. The house was always full of noise and laughter, so different from the silent coldness of Zane's childhood. He taught his children to ride and track and survive in the wilderness, but he also taught them to read and think and feel. He held them when they cried, praised them when they succeeded, and never once told them that emotions were weakness. Thea continued teaching until 1886, when the town finally found another teacher to take over her duties. By then, she was 40 years old and ready to focus more attention on her growing family. She didn't regret her years in the classroom, though. She had helped educate dozens of children, giving them opportunities they never would have had otherwise. Several of her earliest students had gone on to college in San Francisco or Portland, and they wrote to her regularly, thanking her for opening up the world to them. Zane stayed with the logging company, working his way up to superintendent by 1888. He was respected for his fairness and his ability to prevent labor disputes before they turned violent. He still didn't talk much, but when he did speak, people listened. The harsh, emotionless cowboy who had arrived in Portland in 1878 was gone, replaced by a man who still carried himself with quiet strength, but who smiled easily at his wife and children, who laughed at jokes, who showed up to community events and barn raisings and school plays. On their 10th wedding anniversary in 1889, Zane and Thea went back to the river where he had first asked her to marry him. Their children were staying with friends in town, giving them a rare evening alone. They sat on the bank as the sun set, Zane's arm around Thea's shoulders, both of them watching the water flow past. "Do you remember when we first met?" Thea asked. "You were so cold I thought you might actually be carved from stone." Zane chuckled, a sound that still gave Thea a thrill of pleasure. "I remember. I thought you were going to get yourself killed within a month in this rough town. Turns out you were tougher than anyone gave you credit for." "We saved each other," Thea said, leaning into his warmth. "I was running from a failed life, and you were hiding from yourself. And then we found each other and learned how to be whole again." "I learned how to be whole for the first time," Zane corrected. "I don't think I ever was before you." He turned to look at her, his gray eyes soft with love. "You broke through every wall I built. You made me feel when I thought I couldn't. You gave me a life I never imagined I deserved. I love you, Thea. More now than the day we married, which I would not have thought possible." She kissed him as the last light faded from the sky. "I love you too, my harsh cowboy who learned how to smile." "Your harsh cowboy who will love you until his last breath," he promised. "And probably beyond that if love can cross death, because you taught me that emotion is not weakness. It is what makes us human. It is what makes life worth living." They sat together until the stars came out, two people who had found each other in the rough wilderness of the American frontier and had built something beautiful from the broken pieces of their pasts. Behind them, Portland continued its transformation from a rough timber town into a growing city. Around them, Oregon's forests whispered their ancient songs. And between them flowed a love that had begun with tears and a breaking heart, and had grown into something strong enough to weather any storm. Their children grew up healthy and loved. Jacob became a teacher like his mother, carrying on her legacy of education. Rose surprised everyone by becoming interested in medicine, eventually traveling east to study nursing, before returning to Portland to work at the growing hospital. Thomas followed his father into the timber industry, but focused on sustainable forestry practices, trying to balance economic needs with environmental protection. As Zane and Thea grew older together, their love deepened rather than fading. They had weathered hard times, including a particularly brutal winter in 1892 that nearly bankrupted the logging company, and a serious illness that struck Thea in 1895, keeping her bedridden for months while Zane nursed her back to health with the same dedicated tenderness he had shown their children. Through everything, their commitment to each other never wavered. In 1900, on a spring morning that smelled of apple blossoms and fresh grass, Zane and Thea sat on the porch of their house watching their grandchildren play in the yard. Jacob had married and had 2 children of his own, a boy and a girl who called Zane Papa Zane, and climbed on him like he was a living jungle gym. He endured this treatment with good humor, occasionally catching Thea's eye and smiling that slow, warm smile that was his alone. "We have built something good," Thea said, watching her grandson attempt to catch a butterfly. Against all odds in this rough place, we have built something that will last." Zane took her hand, his fingers still strong despite the silver in his hair and the lines on his face. "You built it," he said. "You saved a broken man and taught him how to live. Everything good in my life started the day you dropped that carpet bag in the mud and I caught you before you fell." "We saved each other," Thea insisted, as she always did. "I was lost and alone, and you gave me purpose. You protected me, you loved me, and you let me love you back. That was the bravest thing you ever did, Zane Nolan, learning to be vulnerable after a lifetime of hardness." He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "Best decision I ever made. Even though it started with watching you cry and feeling my heart break. Especially because of that. Because it proved I still had a heart that could break and heal and love." They sat together as the sun climbed higher, surrounded by the evidence of their love in the laughter of grandchildren and the solid walls of the home they had built together. The harsh cowboy had long since disappeared, replaced by a man who had learned that true strength lay not in suppressing emotion, but in having the courage to feel it fully. And the frightened young teacher who had stepped off a stagecoach into a muddy frontier town had become a woman who knew her own worth and the value of the life she had created. Portland continued to grow around them, but this little pocket of peace remained, a testament to the power of love to transform and heal. Years later, long after both Zane and Thea had passed peacefully in their sleep within days of each other, their story would be told by grandchildren and great-grandchildren as an example of how even the most damaged hearts could learn to love again. How tears and breaking hearts could be the beginning rather than the end. How two lost souls could find each other in the wilderness and build something eternal. But on that spring morning in 1900, none of that mattered. What mattered was the warmth of the sun, the sound of children laughing, and the feeling of Zane's hand in Thea's as they watched their legacy unfold before them. They had found love in the most unlikely of places, had fought for it against the odds and had won. Not because their love was perfect, but because they had chosen each other every single day, in big ways and small, until choosing each other had become as natural as breathing. And if sometimes, in quiet moments, Zane still remembered the terrified young woman crying in that alley, and the moment his heart had broken and then immediately begun to heal, he smiled. Because that moment had changed everything. That moment had given him back his humanity. That moment had given him Thea, and through her, a life beyond anything he had ever imagined possible. They had been two broken people who found each other and learned to be whole. And in the end, that was the greatest love story of all.